In the marble corridors of Ravensholm Palace, where whispered secrets could topple kingdoms and a single document could destroy lives, Lady Victoria Ashworth thought she knew the rules of the game. She had married into the most powerful royal family in Europe, believing that love would shield her from the dangerous currents of palace politics. But when mysterious files containing explosive royal secrets began disappearing from her private study, Victoria discovered that even queens are not safe from those closest to them. What she would uncover in her desperate search for the truth would shake the very foundations of the crown, and force her to question everything she thought she knew about the family she had sworn to serve. Lady Victoria Ashworth pressed her trembling fingers against the mahogany desk in her private study, staring at the empty drawer that had contained her most confidential correspondence just hours before. The pale morning light streaming through the tall windows of Ravensholm Palace cast long shadows across the Persian rug, but nothing could illuminate the darkness growing in her heart. Someone had been in her sanctuary, her one private space in the vast royal residence, and they had taken everything. The missing documents weren't just personal letters. They contained sensitive information about the crown's financial dealings, diplomatic communications that could embarrass allied nations, and most damaging of all, medical records that the royal family had fought desperately to keep private. Victoria had been entrusted with these files in her role as the king's personal liaison to the palace's charitable foundations, a position that required the highest level of discretion and trust. As she stood there in her silk morning robe, her auburn hair still loose from sleep, Victoria tried to remember exactly what had been in that drawer. There were letters from foreign dignitaries discussing arms deals that the public believed had been cancelled, financial statements showing the true extent of the crown's offshore investments, and most troubling of all, medical evaluations from the palace physician detailing the king's deteriorating mental condition, a condition that had been carefully hidden from Parliament and the public for over 2 years. The soft knock at her study door made her jump. "Come in," she called, quickly closing the empty drawer and smoothing her robe. Margaret, her longtime personal secretary, entered with a worried expression. The elderly woman had served 3 generations of the Ashworth family and could read Victoria's moods better than anyone.
"My lady, you requested that I wake you if anything unusual occurred during the night."
"I'm afraid there is something you should know."
Victoria's stomach tightened. "What is it, Margaret?" "The night security reported seeing Lady Cordelia near your wing of the palace around 3 in the morning.
She claimed to be looking for a book she had left in the library, but Margaret hesitated, wringing her hands.
"But what?" Victoria's voice was sharper than she intended.
"The library is on the opposite side of the palace, my lady, and she was carrying a leather portfolio when she left." Victoria sank into the chair behind her desk. Lady Cordelia Pemberton was Prince Alexander's second wife, a woman who had married into the royal family just 5 years ago with ambitious plans and few scruples. She had never liked Victoria, viewing her as competition despite the fact that Victoria was married to Alexander's younger brother, Prince Edmund. The two women had maintained a cold but civil relationship for the sake of family harmony. But Victoria had always sensed that Cordelia was waiting for an opportunity to strike.
"Did security stop her or ask to see what was in the portfolio?" Victoria asked.
Margaret shook her head grimly. "She outranks the security staff, my lady. They wouldn't dare question her directly, especially not at that hour." Victoria stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the perfectly manicured gardens where early morning mist still clung to the hedge maze. Beyond the gardens, she could see the flags flying at full staff above the main palace.
A sign that all was supposedly well in the kingdom.
But she knew better. The crown was more fragile than it had ever been, held together by carefully maintained illusions and buried secrets. "Margaret, I need you to do something for me, and I need your complete discretion." "Of course, my lady. Contact James Morton at the Telegraph. Tell him that Lady Victoria requests a private meeting this afternoon." "Use the old code. Tell him the roses in the East Garden need tending." Margaret's eyes widened. James Morton was an investigative journalist who had been quietly documenting royal scandals for years, always staying just within the bounds of what was legally publishable. The code Victoria had mentioned was something she had established months ago, when she first began to suspect that not everything in the royal household was as it seemed. "My lady, are you certain? If Prince Alexander or the king discovers you've been speaking to the press..." Victoria turned back to her secretary, her green eyes filled with a determination that Margaret had never seen before. "Someone has stolen documents that could destroy this family, Margaret. Documents that I was responsible for protecting. If I don't act quickly to control how this information is revealed, it could be used as a weapon against all of us." The truth was more complex than Victoria could explain to Margaret. For months, she had been secretly documenting irregularities in the royal household's financial records, strange payments to foreign accounts, and suspicious meetings between high-ranking courtiers and unknown visitors. She had been planning to present her findings to Prince Edmund, trusting that her husband would know how to address the corruption she had uncovered. But now that someone had stolen her evidence, she realized she might have been naive about how deep the corruption ran, and how many people might be involved.
As Margaret left to make the arrangements, Victoria returned to her desk and pulled out a hidden key from behind a false panel.
There was one more place she kept sensitive documents, a safety deposit box at a private bank in London that even Edmund didn't know about. If she was going to war with whoever had stolen from her, she would need ammunition of her own.
The telephone rang, its sharp sound cutting through the morning silence. Victoria answered on the second ring.
Victoria, darling, I hope I didn't wake you. It was Cordelia's voice, sweet as honey and twice as dangerous. Not at all.
I've been awake for some time. Wonderful. I was wondering if you might join me for tea this afternoon.
I have something rather important to discuss with you. Victoria's hand tightened on the receiver.
The woman had nerve, she would give her that. What sort of important matter? Oh, just some family business that's come to my attention. Nothing too serious, I'm sure, but Alexander thought it best if we ladies handled it between ourselves before involving the men. The implication was clear. Cordelia had the stolen documents, and she wanted to negotiate. Victoria felt a cold anger building in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. I see. What time did you have in mind? Shall we say 4 o'clock? In the blue drawing room? That would be fine. Excellent. Oh, and Victoria? You might want to bring your checkbook. The line went dead, leaving Victoria staring at the phone in her hand. Cordelia was attempting blackmail, which meant the situation was even worse than she had feared. The documents contained information that could not just embarrass the royal family. They could bring down the government.
Victoria spent the next several hours making careful preparations.
She met with James Morton in a small cafe near Westminster Bridge, where she provided him with photocopies of some of the less sensitive documents she had kept in her personal safe. She wanted him to understand the scope of what had been stolen without giving him anything that could be immediately published.
This is extraordinary, Morton said, shuffling through the papers. If these offshore accounts are what I think they are, we're talking about tax evasion on a massive scale.
And these medical reports, I need your word that nothing will be published until I give you the go-ahead, Victoria interrupted. I'm trying to handle this internally first.
Morton studied her face carefully.
What aren't you telling me? Victoria hesitated, then decided that partial honesty was her best strategy.
Someone has stolen the originals of these documents and others like them.
I believe they intend to use them for blackmail. Against whom? Against me, and possibly against the crown itself. Morton leaned back in his chair, his journalist's instincts clearly engaged. This is bigger than family drama, isn't it?
Victoria nodded.
Much bigger. And I may need your help to stop it from destroying everything.
See above.
As she returned to the palace for her confrontation with Cordelia, Victoria felt the weight of the choice she was making. She was about to walk into a room with a woman who held enough information to destroy her marriage, her reputation, and possibly her freedom.
I'm alone, and you are in the way. My mind is not as much as you like me.
But she had no choice. The alternative, allowing Cordelia to control the narrative and use the stolen secrets for her own purposes, was unthinkable. The blue drawing room was one of the palace's more intimate spaces, decorated in silk wallpaper and furnished with antiques that had been in the royal collection for centuries. When Victoria arrived, she found Cordelia already seated at a small table set for tea, looking perfectly composed in an elegant blue dress that matched the room's decor.
Victoria, thank you for coming.
Please, sit. Victoria took the chair across from Cordelia, noting that her sister-in-law had positioned herself with her back to the window, making her expression difficult to read in the afternoon light.
I assume this meeting is about the items that were taken from my study last night, Victoria said without preamble.
Cordelia's smile was razor-sharp. Taken is such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as safeguarding important family documents that had somehow found their way into the wrong hands. Those documents were in my possession legally as part of my official duties. Were they? Because some of them seem to contain information that goes well beyond your charitable work. Financial records, diplomatic correspondence, medical reports.
Cordelia paused to sip her tea.
One might wonder how such sensitive materials came to be in your personal study rather than in the secure files where they belong.
Victoria realized that Cordelia had done her homework.
She knew exactly what had been stolen and understood its significance. This wasn't opportunistic theft. It was a carefully planned attack. What do you want, Cordelia? That's very direct. I appreciate directness. Cordelia set down her teacup and leaned forward slightly.
I want you to resign from all your official positions within the royal household. I want you to withdraw from public life entirely.
And I want you to convince Edmund that a quieter life away from the palace would be better for both of you.
In exchange for what?
In exchange for these documents remaining private family matters rather than becoming public scandals.
Victoria felt the trap closing around her, but she had expected this.
Cordelia wanted her gone, eliminated as a rival for influence within the royal family. The stolen documents were just the weapon she had chosen to use.
And if I refuse? Cordelia's expression hardened. Then I think certain members of Parliament might be very interested to learn about the Crown's creative accounting practices.
And the press would certainly find the king's medical situation newsworthy. Imagine the constitutional crisis that would create. Victoria stood up, her decision made. I need time to consider your proposal. Of course. Shall we say 48 hours?
That should be enough time for you to discuss this with Edmund and make the necessary arrangements. As Victoria walked toward the door, Cordelia called after her. Oh, and Victoria? Don't bother trying to involve Alexander in this.
He's already aware of the situation and has given me his full support in handling it as I see fit. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place in Victoria's mind.
This wasn't just about eliminating her as a rival. It was about consolidating power.
Alexander and Cordelia were positioning themselves to control the royal family's response to the various crises that were coming.
With the king's deteriorating condition and the financial scandals that were bound to surface eventually, they wanted to be the ones managing the narrative and making the decisions. Victoria left the blue drawing room with her mind racing. She had 48 hours to find a way to fight back, but she was no longer facing just Cordelia. She was up against Prince Alexander himself, and possibly others in the royal household who saw her as an obstacle to their plans. As she walked through the long corridors back to her own wing of the palace, Victoria began to formulate a strategy. She had underestimated Cordelia's ambition and Alexander's involvement, but they had also underestimated her. She wasn't just a decorative royal wife. She was an intelligent woman who had spent years learning how the palace really worked, building relationships and gathering information of her own. The war for control of the royal family's future had begun, and Victoria intended to win it. The private dining room where Victoria met with her husband Prince Edmund that evening was illuminated by candlelight, casting dancing shadows on the oil portraits of long-dead royals who gazed down at them with painted eyes that seemed to hold secrets of their own.
Godesob erdemanaeta.
Edmund sat across from her at the mahogany table, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by a gravity that made him look older than his 35 years. "Tell me everything," he said simply, cutting into his beef Wellington with mechanical precision. Victoria had spent the afternoon deciding how much to reveal to her husband. Edmund was a good man, honest and principled, but he was also deeply loyal to his family and sometimes naive about their capacity for deception. She chose her words carefully. "Someone broke into my study and stole confidential documents. Financial records, diplomatic correspondence, medical evaluations. Cordelia has them, and she's demanding that I resign from all my royal duties and that we withdraw from court life entirely." Edmund set down his fork, his blue eyes flashing with anger. "She's blackmailing you?"
Yes. And Alexander is involved?
Victoria nodded, watching her husband's face carefully. She could see the moment when the full implications hit him. His brother, the future king, was actively working against them. What kind of information are we talking about?
How damaging is it? Victoria hesitated. This was the moment when she would have to reveal just how deep she had been digging into the royal family's secrets, and how much she knew about things she was never supposed to discover.
Edmund, I need you to understand something. For the past year, I've been documenting irregularities in the royal household's financial dealings. Strange transfers to offshore accounts, payments to individuals and organizations that don't exist in any official records, discrepancies between what Parliament is told about royal expenses and what the actual expenses are. Edmund stared at her. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" "Because I wasn't sure who was involved or how high up it went.
I thought I was protecting you by keeping you out of it until I had a complete picture.
And now? Now I think the corruption goes deeper than I imagined. The medical files that were stolen contain evidence that your father's mental decline is much more severe than anyone outside his immediate care team knows. He's been having episodes where he doesn't recognize people, where he signs documents he doesn't understand, where he makes statements that have to be corrected or retracted. Edmund pushed back from the table, running his hands through his dark hair.
Are you saying that decisions are being made in his name without his knowledge?
I'm saying that's possible, and I think Alexander and Cordelia want to control that process.
With me out of the picture, there would be fewer people asking uncomfortable questions about discrepancies between official policy and actual practice.
The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of implications that neither wanted to voice.
If the king was truly incapacitated, then Alexander should assume the regency, but only through proper constitutional channels with Parliament's approval. Instead, it seemed that he was operating behind the scenes, making decisions without the proper legal authority. There's something else, Victoria continued. I've been in contact with James Morton at the Telegraph.
Edmund's head snapped up.
The journalist? Victoria, what have you done?
I've given him copies of some of the less sensitive documents.
Nothing that could be published immediately, but enough to give him background on the story if things go wrong.
If things go wrong?
They've already gone wrong. My brother is blackmailing my wife and you're talking to the press. Victoria reached across the table and took his hand.
Edmund, listen to me.
If we do nothing, Cordelia will destroy me, and eventually, she'll come for you too. She wants power, and she's willing to use any weapon to get it. The only way to stop her is to control the narrative ourselves.
By going public with family secrets? By having the option to go public if we need to?
Right now, she holds all the cards because she has the stolen documents. But if the same information becomes public through official channels, through a parliamentary investigation or a proper constitutional process, then her blackmail loses its power. Edmund stood and walked to the window, staring out at the palace gardens where security guards moved like shadows between the trees.
You're talking about destroying the monarchy. I'm talking about saving it.
Edmund, if these financial irregularities become public through a scandal, if foreign governments start questioning diplomatic agreements that were made while the king was incapacitated, if the constitutional crisis comes to light through tabloid headlines rather than proper channels,
That will destroy the monarchy.
what I'm suggesting is that we get ahead of the story by throwing Alexander under the bus, by holding Alexander accountable for his actions. Edmund turned back to her, and Victoria could see the conflict in his eyes. He was being forced to choose between loyalty to his brother and protection of his wife, between family unity and justice. What exactly are you proposing? Victoria had spent hours working out the details of her plan, knowing that she would have only one chance to convince Edmund to support her. Tomorrow morning, you request a private meeting with your father. You tell him that concerns have been raised about the security of sensitive royal documents, and that you believe a full audit of the royal household's files and procedures is necessary. And if he refuses, then you tell him that you have reason to believe someone has already stolen confidential documents and is using them for blackmail. You make it clear that this is not a request, it's a warning about a crisis that's already underway.
And Cordelia?
We call her bluff. I tell her that the documents she stole will be reported as missing to the appropriate authorities, and that any attempt to use them for blackmail will be treated as a criminal matter. Edmund was quiet for a long moment, thinking through the implications. This could tear the family apart.
The family is already being torn apart.
Alexander and Cordelia have chosen to make this a war. We can either fight back or surrender. And if we fight and lose? Victoria met his eyes steadily. Then at least we lose with our integrity intact. The next morning, Victoria watched from her study window as Edmund walked across the courtyard toward the king's private apartments.
It's the finest triple of the century is in Britain. Western Europe is oldest from here.
She had spent a sleepless night wondering if she had made the right choice, if she was asking too much of her husband, if there might have been another way to handle the crisis. But as she saw the determined set of Edmund's shoulders, and the purposeful stride that reminded her why she had fallen in love with him in the first place, she knew they were doing the right thing. Her telephone rang at precisely 9 o'clock. Victoria, I trust you've had time to consider my proposal? Cordelia's voice was as smooth as silk, but Victoria could hear the underlying tension.
I have indeed. And your decision? I've decided to call your bluff, Cordelia.
The documents you stole will be reported as missing to the palace security office this morning, and any attempt to use them for blackmail
will be treated as theft and extortion.
There was a pause, and when Cordelia spoke again, her voice had lost its honeyed tone.
I think you're making a very serious mistake. Perhaps. But it's my mistake to make.
Alexander won't stand for this. Alexander will have to explain to Parliament and the press why he supported the theft of confidential royal documents. I'm not sure that's a conversation he wants to have.
Victoria hung up before Cordelia could respond, her heart pounding with adrenaline.
She had just declared war on the most powerful people in her world, and there was no going back.
An hour later, Margaret burst into her study without knocking, something the elderly secretary had never done in all their years together.
My lady, there are guards at the main entrance to your wing.
They're not allowing anyone in or out without special authorization.
Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of guards? Palace security, but I don't recognize them.
And they're asking to see identification from everyone who approaches, even staff members who've worked here for years.
Victoria walked to her window and looked down at the courtyard.
Sure enough, she could see uniformed figures positioned at strategic points around the palace grounds, more than the usual security complement. This was either a response to a genuine security threat, or it was Alexander's way of sending a message. Margaret, I need you to get a message to Prince Edmund immediately. Tell him that the situation has escalated and that he should expedite his meeting with the king.
As Margaret hurried out, Victoria sat down at her desk and pulled out a secure phone that very few people knew she possessed.
It was a direct line to James Morton, and she had hoped never to use it. Morton here. It's Victoria. I need you to prepare that story for immediate publication. What's happened? I think I may be under some form of house arrest. If you don't hear from me in the next 6 hours, publish everything.
Are you in danger?
Victoria looked out at the guards who were now clearly visible throughout the palace grounds.
I honestly don't know.
The rest of the morning passed in tense silence. Victoria couldn't leave her wing of the palace, and no information was getting through to her about Edmund's meeting with the king.
She began to wonder if her husband had been prevented from seeing his father, or worse, if he had been detained as well. At noon, her worst fears were confirmed when Alexander himself appeared at her study door, flanked by 2 security officers.
Victoria, I think it's time we had a proper conversation. He looked tired, she noticed, and older than his 38 years. The weight of whatever game he was playing was clearly taking its toll, but his resolve seemed unshaken. Where's my husband? Edmund is fine. He's having an extended conversation with father about family loyalty and the proper channels for addressing concerns. And what about your loyalty, Alexander?
To the crown, to the Constitution, to the truth? Alexander stepped into the room and gestured for the guards to wait outside.
When the door closed behind them, his carefully controlled facade cracked slightly.
You think you understand what's at stake here, but you don't. The monarchy is hanging by a thread, Victoria.
Father's condition, the financial irregularities, the diplomatic complications, any one of these things could bring down the government.
All of them together could end the crown entirely.
So you decided to handle it by stealing documents and blackmailing family members? I decided to handle it by taking control of a situation that was spiraling out of control. Those documents you were collecting, the meetings you were having with journalists, did you think no one would notice?
Did you think you could investigate the royal family without consequences? Victoria realized that Alexander had known about her activities long before the theft.
This entire crisis had been orchestrated to remove her from the equation before she could cause more damage.
The truth has consequences, Alexander. But so does covering it up. The truth is a luxury we can't afford right now. What we need is stability, and that requires making some difficult choices. Such as accepting Cordelia's generous offer to retire quietly from public life. Such as understanding that some secrets are too dangerous to pursue.
Victoria stood up, meeting Alexander's gaze directly. And if I refuse? Alexander's expression hardened.
Then you'll discover just how dangerous those secrets really are. The threat was clear, and Victoria felt a chill of real fear for the first time since this crisis began. But she also felt something else. A steely determination that surprised her with its intensity. Then I suppose we'll have to see who blinks first. Alexander studied her face for a long moment, perhaps seeing something there that he hadn't expected. You're making this much harder than it needs to be. Good, because what you're doing should be hard. It should cost you something.
After Alexander left, Victoria sat alone in her study, processing the full scope of what she was facing. This wasn't just about family politics or personal ambition. It was about the fundamental question of who would control the royal family's response to the crises that were coming.
And she was beginning to understand that the stakes were even higher than she had imagined. The war for the soul of the monarchy had begun in earnest.
and Victoria was now completely committed to seeing it through to the end.
That's the best side of the world for chapters that are starting.
The sound of breaking glass echoed through the palace corridors at 3 a.m, jerking Victoria from the uneasy sleep she had finally managed to achieve. She sat up in bed, listening intently as urgent footsteps and muffled voices indicated that something serious was happening elsewhere in the vast building. Through her bedroom window, she could see additional security lights illuminating the gardens and the silhouettes of guards moving with purpose across the grounds. Edmund had not returned to their quarters the previous evening. When Victoria had tried to locate him, she had been told by palace staff that he was attending to urgent family business and would not be available until morning. The evasive answers and nervous glances she received made it clear that her husband was being kept away from her deliberately. Another move in the chess game that Alexander and Cordelia were playing. Margaret appeared at her bedroom door, still wearing her nightgown and looking thoroughly shaken.
My lady, there's been an incident.
The king collapsed during a late-night meeting and has been taken to the hospital wing. Prince Edmund is with him, and Prince Alexander is handling the immediate response. Victoria's mind raced as she processed this information. A late-night meeting was unusual for the king, who typically maintained a very regular schedule due to his declining health. More troubling was the timing, just hours after Edmund's confrontation with Alexander about the stolen documents and the need for an investigation.
What kind of incident?
Was it his heart? Margaret shook her head uncertainly. No, one is saying, my lady.
But I overheard one of the medical staff mentioning something about adverse reactions to medication.
A chill ran through Victoria that had nothing to do with the night air. She had read the stolen medical files carefully, and she knew that the king was taking several medications for his various conditions. She also knew that certain combinations of those medications could be dangerous, especially if the dosages were altered without proper supervision.
Margaret, I need you to find out which doctors are attending to the king and what his condition is.
Use whatever connections you have in the medical staff. My lady, I'm not sure I can get that information. Security is very tight around the hospital wing right now. Victoria moved to her wardrobe and began selecting clothes.
Then we'll have to be creative.
Do you still have that friend who works in the palace laundry?
Yes, Sarah Hutchins.
She's been here almost as long as I have. Laundry staff have access to almost every part of the palace, including the hospital wing. Ask Sarah to volunteer for the morning shift in that area. Have her pay attention to everything she sees and hears. As Margaret hurried off to make arrangements, Victoria dressed quickly and made her way to her study. If the king's condition had genuinely deteriorated, it would trigger a series of constitutional processes that Alexander might try to control. She needed to understand what was happening and whether this medical crisis was as natural as it appeared. The palace felt different in the pre-dawn hours. The usual bustle of servants and officials was replaced by an eerie quiet, broken only by the occasional footstep or murmured conversation. Victoria noticed that there were guards posted at intervals throughout the main corridors.
More than she had ever seen during a routine medical emergency.
Someone was taking extraordinary security precautions.
In her study, Victoria unlocked her secure phone and dialed James Morton's direct number.
The journalist answered on the first ring, clearly already awake.
I was expecting your call.
Word is starting to leak out about the king's condition. What have you heard?
Officially, nothing. Unofficially, sources at the hospital are talking about a serious medical episode that may require extended treatment.
There's speculation about whether he'll be able to resume his duties. Victoria felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in her mind.
James, I need you to investigate something for me.
The king's medical team. Find out if there have been any recent changes to his care, any new doctors brought in, any modifications to his treatment regimen.
Are you suggesting this wasn't a natural medical crisis?
I'm suggesting that the timing is remarkably convenient for certain people who wanted to prevent a full investigation of royal household operations.
There was silence on the other end of the line as Morton processed the implications.
That's a very serious accusation. It's a very serious situation. Can you look into it? I'll make some calls.
But Victoria, if you're right about this, you're in considerable danger. Have you considered leaving the palace until things settle down?
Victoria had considered it, but she knew that leaving now would be seen as an admission of defeat.
It would also leave Edmund to face Alexander and Cordelia alone, and she wasn't willing to abandon her husband when he needed her support most. I'm staying, but I want you to know that if anything happens to me, the story should be told exactly as we've discussed it.
Nothing's going to happen to you.
But I'll have people watching the situation closely. As dawn broke over the palace, Victoria received a formal summons to attend a family meeting in the king's private conference room at 10 o'clock. The message, delivered by a stone-faced servant she didn't recognize, specified that attendance was mandatory for all senior members of the royal household. Victoria spent the morning preparing for what she knew would be a crucial confrontation. She reviewed copies of the documents she had hidden in her personal safe, made notes about the discrepancies she had discovered, and prepared a timeline of events that would support her accusations if she needed to make them public. Margaret returned with disturbing news from her contact in the laundry staff. The king was awake but heavily sedated, and there were indications that his medical team was divided about his treatment. 2 doctors who had been part of his regular care team for years had been replaced overnight with specialists that no one in the hospital wing recognized. Sarah said there was a lot of arguing between the doctors late last night, and one of the original physicians left the palace in obvious anger, Margaret reported. She also overheard someone saying that certain medications had been administered without proper authorization. Victoria felt a cold fury building in her chest. If her suspicions were correct, Alexander and Cordelia had not just stolen documents and attempted blackmail, they had potentially endangered the king's life to prevent him from authorizing an investigation that would expose their activities. When Victoria arrived at the conference room, she found Edmund already seated at the long oak table, looking exhausted and deeply troubled.
Alexander sat at the head of the table in the king's usual chair, while Cordelia occupied the seat to his right. Several other senior members of the royal household were present, including the palace attorney, the chief of staff, and the head of security.
Thank you all for coming, Alexander began without preamble. As you know, His Majesty suffered a serious medical episode last night and is currently receiving intensive care. The physicians believe he will recover, but it may be several weeks or even months before he can resume his duties. Victoria watched Alexander's face carefully as he spoke. Butney's investigation system caused I satisfy. He appeared genuinely concerned about his father, but there was also something else in his expression, a sense of controlled satisfaction that made her stomach turn. In light of the king's condition, the Privy Council has been consulted about the need for a formal regency. The constitutional requirements are clear, and I will be assuming those responsibilities effective immediately.
This was the moment Victoria had been dreading.
With Alexander as regent, he would have the legal authority to make decisions about government policy, royal household operations, and access to sensitive information. He would also be able to control the narrative about the king's condition and the circumstances surrounding his medical crisis.
This is the book. It's about the regular section of the Christian is conducted to other members of our community.
I have several immediate concerns that need to be addressed, Alexander continued. Recent security breaches have compromised sensitive royal documents, and there are indications that these materials may have been shared with unauthorized individuals outside the palace. Victoria felt all eyes in the room turn toward her, and she realized that Alexander was about to make his accusations public to the entire royal household leadership.
I'm calling for a full security review of all document handling procedures, and I'm implementing new protocols for access to sensitive information.
Anyone found to have violated their confidentiality agreements will face immediate dismissal and possible criminal charges.
Edmund spoke for the first time since Victoria had entered the room.
Alexander, I think we need to discuss the circumstances that led to these security concerns. There are questions about how certain documents went missing and why. There are no questions, Edmund. Alexander's voice was sharp with authority. The facts are clear. Confidential materials were removed from secure locations without authorization. That constitutes theft regardless of the motivation behind it. Victoria could remain silent no longer.
What constitutes theft is breaking into someone's private study and stealing documents that were legally in their possession.
The room fell completely silent. Victoria could feel the tension crackling like electricity as everyone present realized they were witnessing a direct confrontation between members of the royal family.
Alexander's expression hardened. Lady Victoria, you are not authorized to possess the documents that were found in your study. Your role with the charitable foundations does not include access to financial records, diplomatic correspondence, or medical information.
Then perhaps you can explain how I came to possess those documents in the first place.
They didn't appear in my study by magic, Alexander. They were given to me by someone who wanted them investigated. Who? Victoria hesitated for just a moment, knowing that her answer would either vindicate her or condemn her.
By your father.
He asked me to review irregularities in the financial records because he was concerned about discrepancies that no one else was willing to address. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria could see shock on the faces of several people around the table, including Edmund. She had just revealed that the king himself had authorized her investigation, which cast Alexander's accusations in a very different light. That's impossible. Cordelia spoke for the first time.
His Majesty would never authorize such an investigation without consulting Prince Alexander. Wouldn't he? Victoria turned her attention to Cordelia, feeling the anger she had been suppressing for days finally breaking free.
Or is the real problem that he was beginning to ask questions about decisions that had been made in his name without his knowledge? Alexander slammed his hand on the table.
That's enough! Lady Victoria, you are relieved of all official duties effective immediately. You will return any and all documents in your possession to the proper authorities, and you will have no further involvement in royal household business.
And if I refuse, then you will face the consequences of your actions.
Legal consequences. Victoria stood up, meeting Alexander's gaze directly. Then I suppose we'll see who the law actually protects.
Because I have evidence of financial irregularities, document theft, and medical negligence that goes straight to the top of this household. Evidence that was obtained illegally.
Evidence that was requested by the king himself, as I'm prepared to testify under oath if necessary.
The standoff stretched between them for what felt like eternity. Victoria could see calculation in Alexander's eyes as he weighed his options. He had expected her to capitulate when faced with the full authority of his position, but instead she was calling his bluff in front of witnesses. Edmund finally broke the silence. I think we all need to step back and consider the implications of what's being said here. If Father did authorize an investigation, then we need to understand why he felt it was necessary.
Father is not in a condition to have authorized anything, Alexander snapped.
He's been confused and disoriented for months. Then how did he manage to give Victoria access to sensitive documents? And why did he request a meeting with you last night to discuss the very issues she's been investigating? Edmund was finally asking the questions that needed to be asked, even though they put his own brother under suspicion. Alexander's face had gone pale, and Victoria realized that Edmund had just revealed something that Alexander hadn't expected to become public. The fact that the king had requested the meeting where his medical crisis occurred.
I think, Victoria said quietly, that it's time for all of us to stop pretending that this is just about stolen documents. The real question is what happens when the king recovers and wants to know why his investigation was shut down and why his medical treatment was altered without his knowledge. The implications of her words hung in the air like a sword over everyone present. Victoria had just accused Alexander of not just theft and blackmail, but of medical malpractice or worse. It was an accusation that could destroy him, but it was also one that put her in mortal danger. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, with raised voices and accusations flying across the table, Victoria realized that the war for control of the monarchy had entered its most dangerous phase. There could be only one winner, and the loser would face consequences that went far beyond mere embarrassment or political defeat. The stakes had just become a matter of life and death. The emergency session of Parliament was called for the following afternoon, sending shockwaves through the British political establishment and foreign capitals alike. After discipline and a tendency that can be fought by other crews as reference to the conflicts of the news and its days of prosecutors, Victoria watched the proceedings from her study through a secure television feed, knowing that the testimony being given would determine not just her own fate, but the future of the constitutional monarchy itself. Dr. Michael Hartwell, the king's longtime personal physician who had been abruptly dismissed the night of the medical crisis, sat at the witness table facing a packed committee room. His silver hair and dignified bearing gave him the appearance of a man whose integrity was beyond question, which made his testimony all the more devastating. In my professional opinion, based on 30 years of caring for His Majesty, the medication changes that were implemented on the night in question were not medically necessary and created a significant risk of adverse reactions, Dr. Hartwell testified. I objected strenuously to the alterations in his treatment protocol, and I was subsequently relieved of my duties without explanation. The committee chairman, a stern-faced member of Parliament with decades of experience in constitutional matters, leaned forward. Dr. Hartwell, who ordered these changes to the king's medication? The orders came from Prince Alexander's office, though they were supposedly approved by a consulting physician I had never met and whose credentials I was unable to verify.
Victoria felt a mix of vindication and dread as she watched the testimony unfold.
James Morton's investigation had uncovered even more damaging evidence than she had expected. including financial records showing payments to the mysterious consulting physician that couldn't be traced through normal channels. Edmund entered her study without knocking, his face grave. "They're calling you to testify tomorrow morning." "What kind of testimony?" "Everything. The stolen documents, your investigation into the financial irregularities, your conversations with the king about his concerns. They want to know exactly what you discovered and when you discovered it."
Victoria muted the television and turned to face her husband.
The past few days had aged him noticeably, etching new lines around his eyes and adding gray to his temples. The stress of choosing between family loyalty and justice was taking its toll. "How is your father?" "Recovering slowly. The new medical team brought in by Parliament has stabilized his condition, and his mental clarity is returning. He's asking questions about what happened." "What kind of questions?" "He wants to know why his investigation was terminated."
He remembers giving you access to the documents, and he remembers requesting a meeting with Alexander to discuss irregularities in the household finances. What he doesn't remember clearly is everything that happened after that meeting began.
Victoria felt a chill of understanding. "Edmund, what if the meeting didn't go the way Alexander expected? What if your father refused to drop the investigation and threatened to take the matter to Parliament himself?" Edmund sank into a chair, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that had become habitual over the past week.
"I've been wondering the same thing. The timing of his medical crisis, the unauthorized medication changes, the sudden appearance of a consulting physician that no one can trace. It's too convenient to be coincidental." "Have you shared your suspicions with the parliamentary committee?"
I've told them everything I know and everything I suspect.
But Edmund looked directly at his wife, his expression filled with a mixture of love and sorrow.
"Victoria, you need to understand what testifying tomorrow will cost you. If you tell the committee everything you've discovered, you'll be directly accusing Alexander and Cordelia of theft, blackmail, and potentially attempted murder."
"They won't forgive that, and they have resources to make your life very difficult."
Victoria had been thinking about little else since the parliamentary investigation was announced. She knew that her testimony could destroy Alexander's chances of ever becoming king and could result in criminal charges that would end Cordelia's ambitions forever.
She also knew that such powerful people didn't accept defeat gracefully. "And if I don't testify truthfully, then the corruption continues, the constitutional crisis deepens, and eventually someone else dies or the monarchy collapses entirely." The stark choice Edmund had laid out was exactly what Victoria had been grappling with for days. She could protect herself by minimizing her testimony and allowing Alexander and Cordelia to escape the consequences of their actions. Or she could tell the complete truth and face whatever retaliation they might devise. Margaret's gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. "My lady, there's a visitor who insists on speaking with you. She says it's about your testimony tomorrow." Victoria felt her stomach tighten. "Who is it?" "Lady Cordelia, my lady. She's waiting in the blue drawing room." Victoria exchanged glances with Edmund. Cordelia's appearance at this crucial moment could mean several things, none of them good. She might be making one final attempt at negotiation, or she might be delivering a threat that would make the stakes even higher. No. If she wanted to negotiate with both of us, she would have requested a meeting with both of us. This is something she wants to say to me alone. Victoria, I don't think.
Edmund, trust me. I need to hear what she has to say, and I need to face her on my own terms.
When Victoria entered the blue drawing room, she found Cordelia standing by the window, looking out at the gardens where autumn had begun to strip the leaves from the trees.
She was dressed impeccably as always, but Victoria could see tension in the rigid line of her shoulders and the way her hands gripped the windowsill.
You look tired, Victoria.
The stress of recent events, I imagine. What do you want, Cordelia? Cordelia turned from the window, her expression carefully neutral. I want to give you one final opportunity to reconsider the path you're choosing. Your testimony tomorrow will destroy more than just Alexander and myself. It will damage the monarchy itself, possibly beyond repair. The monarchy is already damaged. What you and Alexander have done, the theft, the blackmail, the endangerment of the king's life, that's what's destroying it. What we've done has been necessary to protect an institution that's larger than any individual. The financial irregularities you discovered were attempts to secure the royal family's future in an uncertain world. The medical decisions were made by qualified professionals who believed they were acting in the king's best interests. Victoria stared at Cordelia, amazed by the woman's ability to rationalize actions that were clearly criminal. And the blackmail? How is threatening to destroy my life necessary to protect the monarchy? Because your investigation was going to expose information that would have brought down the government. Foreign governments were involved in some of those financial arrangements, Victoria.
diplomatic agreements that maintain peace in several regions of the world. If that information had become public through your amateur investigation, people would have died. For the first time since this crisis began, Victoria felt a moment of uncertainty. She had focused so intently on the domestic implications of what she had discovered that she hadn't considered the international ramifications. What if Cordelia was telling the truth about the diplomatic consequences? If that's true, then why not explain it to me from the beginning?
Yes, I wasn't Peter.
Why the theft and threats instead of honest conversation? Because we couldn't be certain of your discretion. You had already made contact with journalists, and you were planning to take your findings public regardless of the consequences. I made contact with journalists as a backup plan in case something happened to me, which, given recent events, seems to have been a wise precaution.
Cordelia moved away from the window and sat down in one of the antique chairs, gesturing for Victoria to join her. I'm not here to continue our conflict, Victoria.
I'm here to propose a solution that protects everyone involved.
What kind of solution?
Alexander withdraws from the line of succession. He accepts responsibility for the irregularities in the royal household's financial management.
And he agrees to a lifetime ban from any official royal duties.
The stolen documents are returned to you, and no charges are filed related to their theft. Victoria was stunned by the offer. Cordelia was essentially proposing that Alexander destroy his own future to protect everyone else involved. And in exchange? In exchange, you modify your testimony tomorrow to focus on the financial irregularities without discussing the medical issues or the events of the night your documents were stolen. The official story becomes that Alexander discovered the financial problems himself and took responsibility for correcting them. What about you? I return to private life. My marriage to Alexander becomes a personal matter rather than a royal concern. Victoria studied Cordelia's face, trying to understand the calculation behind this offer. It would save the monarchy from a devastating scandal while still holding Alexander accountable for the financial corruption. It would also protect Victoria from further retaliation while allowing her to maintain her integrity by testifying truthfully about what she had discovered. But it would also allow the people responsible for endangering the king's life to escape justice. And if I refuse, then tomorrow's testimony destroys everyone involved, including people who had nothing to do with any of this. Edmund's career ends because of his association with you. The king's health deteriorates further under the stress of public scandal. The monarchy faces a crisis that it may not survive. You're asking me to choose between justice and stability. I'm asking you to choose between revenge and responsibility. Victoria sat in silence for several minutes, weighing the impossible choice that Cordelia had presented. Every instinct told her that allowing Alexander and Cordelia to escape the full consequences of their actions was wrong. But she couldn't ignore the potential damage that complete honesty might cause. I need time to consider your proposal. There isn't time. The committee expects your testimony in 12 hours. Then you'll have my answer in the morning. After Cordelia left, Victoria spent the evening walking through the palace gardens with Edmund, discussing the choice she faced and its implications. The autumn air was crisp and clear, and the formal gardens that had witnessed centuries of royal drama provided a backdrop for what might be one of the most important conversations of their lives. "What does your conscience tell you to do?" Edmund asked as they paused beside a fountain that had been a wedding gift from a long-dead foreign monarch. It tells me to tell the complete truth and let the consequences fall where they may. But my practical side wonders if destroying the monarchy to punish Alexander and Cordelia is worth the price that others will pay. And what about the precedent it sets? If they escape consequences for this, what happens the next time someone decides that the rules don't apply to them? Victoria had been wrestling with the same question. The choice she made would establish whether the royal family was subject to the same laws as everyone else, or whether their position placed them above accountability. There's something else to consider, Edmund continued. Father is recovering his strength and his mental clarity. If we allow this matter to be resolved quietly, he may demand his own investigation once he's fully recovered. We might just be postponing the crisis rather than resolving it. As they walked back toward the palace, Victoria made her decision. She would testify completely and honestly, regardless of the consequences. The monarchy could survive scandal and crisis. It had done so many times throughout its history. What it could not survive was the systematic corruption of the principles it was supposed to represent. The next morning, as Victoria prepared to leave for Parliament, she received an unexpected visitor. The king himself, looking frail but determined, appeared at her study door supported by his private secretary.
Victoria, my dear, I wanted to thank you personally before you testify today. Your Majesty, you should be resting. I'll have time to rest when this matter is resolved properly.
What you did
Investigating the irregularities, standing up to Alexander and Cordelia, risking your own position to protect the crown, that took considerable courage.
I was just doing what you asked me to do.
You were doing what was right, even when it became dangerous.
That's exactly the kind of character this family needs. The king paused, looking directly into her eyes. Tell them everything, Victoria. All of it. Let the truth determine the outcome.
With those words ringing in her ears, Victoria left the palace to face the parliamentary committee and deliver testimony that would change the royal family forever.
As her car pulled away from Ravensholm Palace, she looked back at the building that had been her home for 7 years and wondered if she would ever see it again as anything other than a visitor.
But she was at peace with her choice. The truth, whatever its cost, was worth defending. The committee room in Parliament was packed beyond capacity when Victoria entered to give her testimony. Cameras from international news organizations lined the walls, and the public gallery was filled with citizens who had come to witness what many were calling the most significant constitutional crisis in modern British history.
The weight of their attention was almost overwhelming, but Victoria kept her focus on the committee members who would determine the outcome of this investigation.
Lord Chancellor Margaret Whitfield, a distinguished woman in her 60s who had served in Parliament for over 3 decades, called the session to order.
Lady Victoria Ashworth, you have been called to testify regarding irregularities in royal household operations and related security breaches. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do. Victoria had spent the previous night reviewing every document, every conversation, and every detail of the past year's events.
She had prepared herself to answer any question honestly, regardless of how it might affect her relationship with the royal family or her own future.
Lady Victoria, please describe your official role within the royal household and how you first became aware of financial irregularities.
Victoria began with the basics, explaining her position as liaison to the Royal Charitable Foundations and the access to financial records that role provided. She described how discrepancies in the accounts had first caught her attention. Payments to organizations that didn't appear to exist, transfers to offshore accounts that couldn't be traced, expenses that didn't match the official budgets provided to Parliament. Initially, I thought these might be clerical errors or accounting mistakes, but as I investigated further, I realized they followed patterns that suggested deliberate concealment of the true nature of these transactions.
Did you report these concerns to your supervisors? I reported them to His Majesty directly.
He expressed concern about the irregularities and asked me to compile a comprehensive report documenting what I had found. A murmur went through the gallery at this revelation.
Victoria could see several committee members exchanging glances, clearly surprised that the king himself had authorized the investigation.
When did this conversation with His Majesty take place? Approximately 6 months ago.
He was lucid and engaged, asking detailed questions about the financial discrepancies and expressing particular concern about payments that had been made to foreign accounts without his knowledge or authorization. Lord Chancellor Whitfield leaned forward. Lady Victoria, you've had access to His Majesty's medical records. In your assessment, was he mentally competent to authorize such an investigation? Victoria had dreaded this question because it forced her to address the king's deteriorating condition while also defending his capacity to make important decisions. His Majesty has been experiencing periods of confusion and disorientation, but during our meetings about the financial irregularities, he was alert and capable of complex reasoning. He understood the implications of what I was showing him and made deliberate choices about how to proceed.
What kind of choices?
He instructed me to gather evidence discreetly and to report directly to him rather than going through normal palace channels. He was concerned that the irregularities might involve people in positions of authority within the royal household.
The committee spent the next 2 hours going through Victoria's findings in detail. She presented photocopies of documents showing questionable payments, transfers that violated constitutional restrictions on royal finances, and communications with foreign entities that had not been reported to Parliament as required by law. The most damaging revelation came when Victoria was asked about the diplomatic implications of her discoveries. Several of the offshore accounts were connected to arms dealers and defense contractors in regions where Britain has officially neutral positions.
Payments were being made that could be construed as supporting one side or another in ongoing conflicts, which would violate our stated foreign policy. Did you find evidence of who was authorizing these payments?
Victoria hesitated for just a moment, knowing that her next words would destroy Alexander's political future permanently.
The authorization codes on the payment orders were traced back to Prince Alexander's office. However, Many of these payments were made during periods when His Majesty's condition might have prevented him from providing proper oversight. She had found a way to be truthful while also acknowledging the complex circumstances that might have contributed to the situation. It was the kind of nuanced testimony that protected the institution while still holding individuals accountable. The committee chairman turned to the events of the previous week. Lady Victoria, please describe how your investigation was brought to an end.
Victoria took a deep breath and began recounting the theft of her documents, Cordelia's blackmail attempt, and the confrontation in the blue drawing room. She was careful to stick to facts rather than interpretations, but the timeline she presented painted a clear picture of criminal behavior designed to cover up the financial irregularities.
After Lady Cordelia demanded that I resign from all royal duties and withdraw from public life in exchange for keeping the stolen documents private, I realized that this was no longer just about financial irregularities. It had become about who would control information that could affect the constitutional stability of the monarchy.
How did you respond to this demand?
I refused. I informed Lady Cordelia that the theft would be reported to appropriate authorities and that I would not be blackmailed into silence about matters that affected the public interest.
The most dramatic moment came when Victoria was asked about the king's medical crisis on the night of his confrontation with Alexander. Did you have any reason to believe that His Majesty's medical emergency was anything other than a natural occurrence? Victoria paused, knowing that her answer would determine whether criminal charges might be filed against Alexander and Cordelia.
But is this not critical?
I discovered that His Majesty's regular physician had been dismissed and his medication regimen altered without proper medical justification. The timing of these changes, occurring immediately after His Majesty requested a meeting with Prince Alexander about the investigation, raised serious questions about whether his medical care was being compromised for political reasons.
The committee room erupted in noise as reporters and observers reacted to what amounted to an accusation of attempted murder.
Lord Chancellor Whitfield called for order, but Victoria could see that her testimony had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Lady Victoria, are you alleging that Prince Alexander or Lady Cordelia deliberately endangered His Majesty's health?
I am stating that unauthorized changes were made to His Majesty's medical treatment at a time when those changes served the political interests of people who wanted to prevent his investigation from proceeding.
Whether that constitutes criminal behavior is for others to determine. The questioning continued for another hour, covering details about Victoria's contact with journalists, her decision to prepare for public disclosure of the irregularities, and her assessment of the constitutional implications of what she had discovered.
As Victoria's testimony concluded, she felt both exhausted and relieved. She had told the complete truth about everything she had discovered and experienced, and she had done so in a way that focused on protecting the institution of the monarchy rather than seeking revenge against individuals. Lord Chancellor Whitfield addressed Victoria directly as the session ended. Lady Victoria, your testimony today has provided this committee with crucial information about serious irregularities in royal household operations. You should know that your willingness to speak truthfully, despite obvious personal risks, exemplifies the kind of integrity that strengthens rather than weakens our constitutional system. As Victoria left Parliament, she was surrounded by reporters shouting questions and camera crews documenting her every move. But her attention was focused on Edmund, who was waiting by their car with an expression of pride and love that made everything she had endured worthwhile. "How did I do?" she asked as they drove away from the chaos.
You did exactly what needed to be done.
You told the truth and let others decide what to do with it. The consequences of Victoria's testimony began unfolding within hours. Prince Alexander announced his withdrawal from the line of succession that evening, accepting responsibility for failures of oversight in royal household financial management. Lady Cordelia was arrested the following morning on charges of theft, blackmail, and conspiracy, becoming the first member of the royal family to face criminal prosecution in over a century. The king's recovery accelerated once his proper medical team was restored, and within 2 weeks, he was well enough to address Parliament personally about the events that had transpired. His speech was brief but powerful, thanking Victoria publicly for her courage in protecting the crown from those who would corrupt it, and announcing comprehensive reforms to royal household operations that would prevent similar abuses in the future. 6 months later, Victoria stood in the same blue drawing room where Cordelia had attempted to blackmail her, but now the space had been converted into her new office as the royal household's first Inspector General for Constitutional Compliance.
Her role was to ensure that the financial and operational reforms instituted after the scandal were being properly implemented and maintained.
Edmund had been appointed as the king's special representative for parliamentary relations, a position that utilized his legal background and his reputation for integrity.
Together, they were working to rebuild trust between the monarchy and the British people while ensuring that the institution remained accountable to constitutional principles.
The morning sun streaming through the windows illuminated a portrait that had been recently added to the room's decor, a painting of Victoria presenting her testimony to Parliament, commissioned by the king himself as a reminder that courage and truth were more valuable than loyalty and silence. Margaret knocked and entered with the morning correspondence.
My lady, there's a letter from the University of Cambridge. They're offering you an honorary doctorate in constitutional law.
Victoria smiled as she opened the letter. The past year had transformed her from a decorative royal wife into a genuine guardian of constitutional principles, and institutions were beginning to recognize the importance of what she had accomplished.
There's also this, Margaret continued, holding out a second letter with a concerned expression. Victoria's smile faded as she recognized the expensive stationery and elegant handwriting.
It was from Cordelia, writing from the minimum security prison where she was serving her sentence for theft and conspiracy. The letter was brief.
My dear Victoria, I hope you understand that this isn't over.
Some games are played across decades rather than months. I look forward to our next match. Cordelia. Victoria set the letter aside and turned back to the window, looking out at the palace gardens where autumn was giving way to winter. She understood Cordelia's message perfectly. The woman who had tried to destroy her considered this merely a temporary setback rather than a final defeat. But Victoria was no longer the naive royal wife who had stumbled onto financial irregularities in her charitable work. She was now a trained investigator with institutional support, legal authority, and most importantly, the knowledge that the truth was worth defending regardless of the cost.
Edmund appeared in the doorway carrying 2 cups of tea and wearing the expression of contentment that had returned to his face once the crisis was resolved.
Any interesting mail today?
Victoria held up the letter from Cordelia, just a reminder that some battles are won but never finished.
Edmund read the letter and shook his head with amusement rather than concern. I think Lady Cordelia underestimates how much you've changed.
The woman who testified before Parliament isn't someone who can be intimidated by prison letters. As Victoria sipped her tea and reviewed her agenda for the day, she reflected on how the events of the past year had transformed not just her own life, but the entire royal household.
The monarchy was stronger because it had faced its own corruption and chosen truth over convenience. The constitutional system had been tested and had proven resilient enough to hold even the most powerful people accountable for their actions.
This is undoubtedly true, that the monarchy is stronger because it has made this power sustainable.
And Victoria herself had discovered that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the willingness to do what was right despite being afraid. That lesson would serve her well in whatever challenges lay ahead, whether they came from Cordelia's promised revenge or from new threats to the institution she had sworn to protect. The game of royal politics would continue, with new players and new stakes, but Victoria was no longer a pawn to be manipulated. She had become a player in her own right, and she was ready for whatever moves her opponents might make. Outside her window, spring was beginning to return to the palace gardens, bringing new life and new possibilities. Victoria smiled and turned back to her work, knowing that she had found her true calling in the most unlikely circumstances, defending the truth in a world built on carefully maintained illusions.
Grogden saw, and every day he sat down, with the world built on carefully maintained illusions.
The story of the stolen documents and the woman who refused to be silenced had ended, but the larger story of constitutional accountability and royal responsibility was just beginning, and Victoria Ashworth intended to be at the center of that story for many years to come.